He found him propped against corroded steel, twin bundles pressed to his blood-soaked chest like the last prayer of a dying god. December wind cut through the industrial sector like a blade through silk, violent, precise, and indifferent. The warehouse district sat abandoned at 2 a.m., a graveyard of rusted loading docks and shattered fluorescent lights that flickered like dying stars. Minsuk's delivery van rattled over potholes filled with black ice, the GPS on his phone glitching between Korean and English, both languages insisting the address didn't exist. He'd been awake for 19 hours. 3 delivery jobs back-to-back because rent was due and his landlord didn't accept excuses in any language. His stomach gnawed at itself. Dinner had been the other half of yesterday's convenience store kimbap, and breakfast would be whatever he could afford after this shift. If this shift ever ended. If he ever found Building 7, Row D, which according to every map he'd checked, had been demolished in 2019. Minsuk had learned not to ask questions. Delivery drivers who saw too much didn't get tips, they got disappeared. But the order had already been paid, triple his usual rate, and he'd already mentally allocated it. $200 to rent, $50 to the loan shark circling his old pack debt, $30 to the phone bill that kept him connected to the only world where he wasn't invisible. He had nothing, which meant he had everything to lose. He should have turned around when the silence hit him. Not the peaceful kind, the predatory kind, the kind that came before gunfire in the action movies he watched on his cracked phone screen. But then he heard it. Not the crying yet. First came the breathing. Wet, labored, the sound of a punctured lung fighting for one more second. His nursing instinct, the one he'd tried to bury under 2 years of just surviving, flared hot and urgent in his chest. Every rational thought screamed run. Minsuk's hand was already reaching for the door handle. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. He found him propped against corroded steel, twin bundles pressed to his blood-soaked chest like the last prayer of a dying god. December wind cut through the industrial sector like a blade through silk, violent, precise, and indifferent. The warehouse district sat abandoned at 2 a.m., a graveyard of rusted loading docks and shattered fluorescent lights that flickered like dying stars. Minsuk's delivery van rattled over potholes filled with black ice, the GPS on his phone glitching between Korean and English, both languages insisting the address didn't exist. He'd been awake for 19 hours. 3 delivery jobs back-to-back because rent was due and his landlord didn't accept excuses in any language. His stomach gnawed at itself. Dinner had been the other half of yesterday's convenience store kimbap, and breakfast would be whatever he could afford after this shift. If this shift ever ended. If he ever found Building 7, Row D, which according to every map he'd checked, had been demolished in 2019. Minsuk had learned not to ask questions. Delivery drivers who saw too much didn't get tips, they got disappeared. But the order had already been paid, triple his usual rate, and he'd already mentally allocated it. $200 to rent, $50 to the loan shark circling his old pack debt, $30 to the phone bill that kept him connected to the only world where he wasn't invisible. He had nothing, which meant he had everything to lose. He should have turned around when the silence hit him. Not the peaceful kind, the predatory kind, the kind that came before gunfire in the action movies he watched on his cracked phone screen. But then he heard it. Not the crying yet. First came the breathing. Wet, labored, the sound of a punctured lung fighting for one more second. His nursing instinct, the one he'd tried to bury under 2 years of just surviving, flared hot and urgent in his chest. Every rational thought screamed run. Minsuk's hand was already reaching for the door handle. The Alpha didn't lower the gun when Minsuk rounded the corner of the loading dock. Gray eyes tracked him with the mechanical precision of a predator calculating whether to kill or conserve energy for dying. Blood pooled black beneath him, spreading in slow rivulets between the cracks in the concrete. The twins, one wrapped in yellow, one in blue, screamed with the primal fury of newborns who understood, on some cellular level, that their protector was failing. "Don't!" The Alpha rasped in accented English, the gun wavering. "Don't come closer." Minsuk's hands rose instinctively, palms out, the universal language of harmless. But his feet kept moving forward because the man's lips were gray, and his breathing was wrong, and those babies were going to freeze to death in the next 20 minutes. "I'm a delivery driver," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "I'm nobody. But you're going into shock, and those children are hypothermic, and if you shoot me, we all die here." The Alpha's finger twitched on the trigger. Then his eyes rolled back, and the gun clattered to the ground. Minsuk didn't remember making the decision. One moment he was frozen, the next he was moving, checking the pulse point at the Alpha's throat, assessing the bullet wounds in his chest and abdomen with hands that remembered anatomy lessons from a life he'd abandoned. 2 entry wounds, no exits. Internal bleeding. Maybe an hour if he was lucky. The Alpha's scent hit him then, breaking through the copper tang of blood, storm and gunpowder, and something ancient that made Min-suk's Omega hindbrain whisper dangerous, powerful mine. He shoved the instinct down and grabbed the car seats. The van's heater sputtered to life as Min-suk peeled out of the lot, the Alpha's dead weight slumped against the passenger door, the twins shrieking in the back. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip the wheel. The industrial district blurred past in streaks of sodium light and shadow, every pair of headlights a potential threat. The Alpha had mumbled something before passing out, a name, maybe, or a warning. But Min-suk's Russian was limited to the curse words his PAX enforcers used to throw at him. Then the SUV appeared in his rearview mirror. Black, tinted windows, following 2 car lengths back with the patient inevitability of a predator tracking wounded prey. Min-suk's heart slammed against his ribs. He took a sharp right down an alley barely wider than his van, garbage bags exploding under his tires, the twins screaming reaching a fever pitch. The SUV couldn't follow, too wide, but the driver's side mirror clipped the brick wall as Min-suk emerged onto a side street, and he knew they'd radio ahead. "Wake up," Min-suk hissed at the Alpha. "I don't know where I'm going." "Wake up." Gray eyes cracked open, unfocused. "Levoy," the Alpha slurred. "Left." Min-suk yanked the wheel. They careened through a red light, horns blaring, and suddenly they were in the Omega district. Narrow streets lined with 24-hour laundromats and shuttered restaurants, the only part of the city that never fully slept because Omegas worked the graveyard shifts no one else would take. The Alpha's hand shot out and gripped Min-suk's wrist with shocking strength, his voice clearer now, sharpened by pain. "Tam. There. The blue building." It was Min-suk's building. "How do you?" But there wasn't time. Another SUV rounded the corner 3 blocks back. Min-suk floored it into the underground parking garage, killed the lights, and held his breath as the SUV's headlights swept past the entrance and continued down the street. The silence that followed was broken only by the twins' exhausted whimpering and the Alpha's labored breathing. Min-suk's hands were still shaking when he turned to find the Alpha watching him. Not with the glazed confusion of blood loss, but with the cold assessment of a man who'd just recalculated someone's value. "You didn't run," the Alpha said in English, each word precise despite the blood on his lips. "Why?" Min-suk didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound insane. Because his father's voice haunted him. Because he was tired of being invisible. Because 2 babies were crying and every instinct he'd tried to kill was screaming at him to save something, anything, for once in his worthless life. "Because they needed me," he finally said. The Alpha's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it wasn't so sharp. "What's your name, Omega?" "Min-suk. J. Min-suk." "Dmitri." His eyes were already closing again. "Dmitri Volkov. And you just saved the most dangerous man in this city." The words hung in the cold garage air as Min-suk stared at the blood seeping through his passenger seat, at the twins who'd finally cried themselves into silence, at the choice he'd made that couldn't be unmade. Dawn was breaking somewhere above them, painting the concrete ramp in shades of gray and rust. He grabbed the car seats and started toward the elevator. Dimitri's weighed a dead anchor against his shoulder, and didn't let himself think about the fact that he'd just invited death itself into his home. Min-suk's apartment was 200 square feet of everything wrong with his life. Water-stained ceiling. Kitchenette with 2 working burners. A futon that doubled as couch and bed, currently occupied by a bleeding Russian crime lord who refused to lose consciousness despite 2 bullets lodged in his torso and enough blood loss to kill a normal man. "You need to stop moving," Min-suk said for the 4th time, arranging his pathetic collection of supplies on the coffee table. A bottle of cheap vodka, fishing line he'd bought for a camping trip he never took, kitchen knife heating over the stove's blue flame, and a half-empty first aid kit that contained exactly 3 gauze pads and a roll of medical tape. Dimitri's gray eyes tracked every movement with the alertness of a man who'd learned that unconsciousness meant death. "Do it," he rasped. One of the twins, the one in yellow, was crying again from the cardboard box Min-suk had lined with his only clean towels. "But if you kill me, they die too. My men will find this place within 6 hours." "Your men are the ones trying to kill you," Min-suk snapped, hands shaking as he pulled the knife from the flame. The blade glowed dull orange in the dark apartment. Dawn light was just beginning to creep through the single window, gray and cold. "So forgive me if that's not particularly motivating." Something that might have been respect flickered across Dimitri's face. "Not all of them. just the ones who followed Victor. He gripped the edge of the futon, knuckles white. There's a phone. Inside pocket. Left side. When this is done, you call the number under Alexei. Minsuk found the phone, blood-slicked, expensive, the kind that cost more than 3 months of his rent. He set it aside and poured vodka over his hands, then over the knife. The alcohol smelled sharp and clinical in the small space. His stomach was eating itself from hunger and fear, but his hands had stopped shaking. This part he knew. This part he'd been good at before the university decided male omegas were too much of a distraction in surgical rotations. This is going to hurt, he said. Everything hurts, small chick. Dimitri's shirt was already gone, revealing a torso mapped with old scars and new wounds. The bullet holes were neat, one below the right collarbone, one in the left side of his abdomen. The exit wounds would be catastrophic if they existed, which meant both bullets were still inside. Do what you do. Minsuk pressed the vodka-soaked towel to the shoulder wound first, and Dimitri's entire body went rigid, but he didn't make a sound. The Omega's fingers found the bullet within 30 seconds. Lodged against the scapula, a miracle it hadn't shattered bone. He worked the knife tip around the edges, blood welling hot over his hands, and Dimitri watched him the entire time with those cold gray eyes that saw too much. You've done this before, Dimitri said through gritted teeth. Nursing school. Before I dropped out. The bullet came free with a wet sound and pinged against the coffee table. Minsuk was already packing the wound with gauze, his movements automatic, muscle memory from a life he'd convinced himself he didn't want anymore. Or before they expelled me. Depends on how you frame it. Why? Because male omegas don't belong in operating rooms. We belong in nurseries, apparently. The bitterness in his voice surprised him. He threaded the fishing line through the needle he'd sterilized in boiling water, took a breath, and started stitching. His father had taught him this on oranges and raw chicken, back when he'd still believed Minsuk could be something other than a disappointment. The irony isn't lost on me. Dimitri's hand shot out and caught his wrist, grip iron strong despite the blood loss. You're wasted on delivery driving. The twin in blue started crying now, a harmony of infant distress that made Minsuk's Omega instincts scream. He jerked his wrist free and focused on the stitches, small, even the kind that would leave minimal scarring if infection didn't set in first. The second one's deeper, he said, ignoring the way his pulse had jumped at the alpha's touch. In your abdomen. If it nicked your intestine, you'll be dead by tomorrow from sepsis, and there's nothing I can do about that. Then work fast. The abdominal wound was worse. The bullet had tunneled through muscle and lodged near the peritoneum, and Minsuk had to go deeper than he wanted with a kitchen knife that wasn't designed for surgery and hands that were designed for this, but had been told they weren't good enough. Dimitri's breathing went ragged, his sense spiking with pain, gunpowder and ozone and something darker that made Minsuk's hindbrain whimper with want despite the insanity of the situation. Tell me about them, Minsuk said, desperate for distraction. The twins. Dimitri's jaw unclenched slightly. Alexei and Anya. 3 days old. Their mother, his voice fractured. She didn't survive the birth. Minsuk's fingers found the second bullet. I'm sorry. Don't be. She knew what she was marrying into. The words were harsh, but the grief underneath was raw as the wounds Minsuk was stitching closed. Victor waited until she was dead to make his move. He called it mercy, letting me have one last night with them before he took everything. The bullet came free and Minsuk set it aside, his hands moving through the familiar rhythm of cleaning, stitching, bandaging. When he finally sat back, his shirt was soaked with blood and his vision was spotting from hunger and adrenaline crash. Dimitri's eyes had finally closed, his breathing evening out into something that might actually be sleep. Minsuk turned his attention to the twins. The formula he made from canned evaporated milk, boiled water, and a spoonful of sugar was probably nutritionally insufficient and definitely not sterile. But it was all he had. He fashioned diapers from clean kitchen towels and safety pins, his movements gentle as he cleaned them, fed them, wrapped them against his chest where his Omega scent, rain and something softer, sweeter, seemed to calm them in a way nothing else had. Anya stopped crying first, her tiny fist curling against his collarbone. Alexei followed minutes later, both of them falling into the deep sleep of infants who'd been terrified and were finally, impossibly safe. Minsuk looked at Dimitri, the dangerous alpha who'd invaded his life with blood and babies and impossible choices, and felt something shift in his chest. The alpha's face was softer in sleep, the harsh lines smoothed by exhaustion, and Minsuk could see the ghost of the man who'd loved his mate enough to clutch their children in his last moments of consciousness. He fetched a clean towel and warm water, and began washing the blood from Dimitri's skin with careful hands, learning the geography of scars and muscle. the places where old violence had left its mark. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with trust. Dmitri didn't wake, but his scent shifted. Less ozone, more something warm and protected that made Min-suk's Omega instincts purr with satisfaction. When he finally collapsed onto the floor beside the futon, the twins nestled in their cardboard bassinet and Dmitri breathing steadily above him, Min-suk let himself acknowledge the truth. He'd just bet his entire life on a stranger's survival, and somewhere in the blood and the stitches and the crying babies, he'd stopped being afraid. He didn't know if that made him brave or insane. But as dawn fully broke over the Omega district and the world outside continued not knowing that everything had changed, Min-suk closed his eyes and slept. Min-suk woke to the sound of a gun being cocked 3 inches from his face. Gray eyes stared down at him, no longer clouded with blood loss but sharp and cold as winter steel. Dmitri sat upright on the futon. The Glock he must have concealed somewhere held with the casual competence of a man who'd killed before and would again. The morning light cut across his bare torso, highlighting the white bandages stark against his skin, the dark bruising that had bloomed overnight. "Talk," Dmitri said, "and choose your words carefully." Min-suk's heart slammed against his ribs, but he didn't move, sprawled on the floor where exhaustion had dropped him 6 hours ago. The twins were still sleeping in their cardboard box, tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful oblivion. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have spent half the night pulling bullets out of you with a kitchen knife." That's not an answer. The gun didn't waver. "Who sent you? Was it Victor? One of the other families?" "Nobody sent me." Min-suk sat up slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. His back ached from the floor, and his clothes were still crusted with dried blood. "I'm a delivery driver who took the wrong order and found you dying. That's it. That's the entire conspiracy." Dmitri's jaw tightened. People don't help for nothing. People don't expect to find bleeding mafia bosses holding newborns either. But here we are. Min-suk's voice came out sharper than he intended, exhaustion and fear making him reckless. "You said your name last night. Dmitri Volkov. I don't know Russian organized crime, but I know enough to realize I should have left you there. Except I didn't. So either shoot me or put the gun down, because I need to feed your children, and I can't do that while you're having a paranoid breakdown." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of traffic from the street below and Anya making small sleeping noises. Then Dmitri lowered the gun, something like grim amusement crossing his face. "You have a death wish, Omega. I have a headache and no coffee." Min-suk stood, joints protesting, and moved toward the kitchenette. "And if we're doing interrogations, you're going to tell me exactly what I've gotten myself into." The truth came in fragments while Min-suk heated formula and changed diapers fashioned from the last of his clean towels. Dmitri spoke in clipped sentences, his accent thickening when he talked about his mate, Irina, a Ukrainian Omega from a rival family, the marriage alliance that was supposed to end a decade of bloodshed. She'd died 3 days after the twins were born, complications the doctors called unavoidable and Dmitri called murder by negligence. Victor was my head of security. 20 years of loyalty. Dmitri held Alexei with surprising gentleness, the baby's fist wrapped around his finger. He said I was distracted. That grief made me weak. That the Volkov Bratva needed a leader who could make hard choices. His expression went flat, dangerous. So he made one. Killed my inner circle, took control of my accounts, and left me in that warehouse to bleed out where no one would find the body. Min-suk fed Anya, her tiny mouth working at the improvised bottle, and tried to process the enormity of it. "But someone will find you here. Eventually." Dmitri's gaze swept the apartment. The water stains, the single window with its broken blind. The stack of overdue bills on the counter that Min-suk had stopped opening because the numbers only ever got worse. This is the last place they'd look. The Omega district. No security, no cameras, no one who matters. He said it without cruelty, just stating facts. "You live here alone?" "For 2 years. Since my pack disowned me." Min-suk surprised himself with the honesty. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the surreal domesticity of feeding babies with a crime lord while discussing betrayal and murder. Male Omegas aren't valued in traditional packs. We can't bear children, can't form alliances through mating contracts. I presented at 19, and they kicked me out within a month. Something shifted in Dmitri's expression. "And the nursing school?" "Lost my scholarship when I presented. Apparently Omega biology makes us too emotionally volatile for surgical precision." Min-suk's laugh was bitter. "Though I did fine last night, didn't I? Better than fine." Dmitri stood, moving to the window with Alexei cradled against his chest. He moved carefully, testing the limits of his injuries, and Min-suk could see the pain he was suppressing with pure will. You saved my life. Both our lives. That creates a debt. I don't want. Not about what you want, Malchik. About what is. Dmitri pulled out the blood-stained phone from last night, pressed a number. The conversation was rapid-fire Russian, too quick for Minsuk to follow, but he caught names, Alexei, Victor, and something that sounded like coordinates. When Dmitri ended the call, his expression was grim satisfaction. Help is coming. 2 hours. Maybe 3. Minsuk's stomach dropped. Help meaning more people who'll know I'm involved. Help meaning people I trust. The ones Victor didn't get to. Dmitri turned from the window, backlit by weak morning sun, looking like something out of a nightmare, bandaged, dangerous, holding a sleeping infant like it was the most natural thing in the world. You're already involved. The moment you pulled those bullets out, you became a part of this. The weight of it settled over Minsuk like a physical thing. His tiny apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. He looked at the overdue rent notice on the counter, the empty fridge, the life he'd built out of scraps and spite. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern was making enough for rent. Now he was harboring a mafia boss and waiting for armed Russians to arrive at his door. I should have left you there, Minsuk said, but there was no conviction in it. Dmitri's mouth curved into something sharp. But you didn't. He crossed the room, moving into Minsuk's space with predatory grace despite his injuries. Up close, his scent was overwhelming. Gunpowder and something darker, richer, that made Minsuk's Omega instincts surge with want and warning in equal measure. Why? And don't say it's because of the babies. I've seen enough altruism to know it doesn't look like kitchen surgery at 3 a.m. Minsuk met those cold gray eyes and found himself saying the truth he'd barely admitted to himself. Because I'm tired of being useless. Because for one night, I got to be what I trained to be before the world decided I wasn't worth the investment. His voice went quiet. Because your children needed someone and I was there. Dmitri studied him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then he reached out and gripped the back of Minsuk's neck. Not threatening, but grounding, the touch of an alpha acknowledging an omega's worth. You're wasted on this life, J. Minsuk. Before Minsuk could respond, Anya started crying, shattering the moment. The domesticity returned, bottles and diapers and the careful dance of two strangers caring for infants while the world outside hunted them. Minsuk washed blood from his clothes in the sink while Dmitri made phone calls in Russian, and somewhere in the mundane horror of it all, Minsuk realized he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. When the knock came 2 hours later, 3 sharp raps, a pause, 2 more. Dmitri answered with his gun drawn and Minsuk held both twins, and neither of them pretended this was anything but the beginning of something that would either save them or destroy them. The wolf had woken, and Minsuk was no longer invisible. The man who arrived at Minsuk's door was built like a tank and smelled like gunmetal and expensive cologne. Alexei, the other Alexei, Dmitri's captain, swept the apartment with ice-blue eyes that catalogued everything. The blood-stained futon, the cardboard box nursery, Minsuk hovering protectively over the twins. His Russian to Dmitri was curt, efficient, and from the alpha's expression, not good news. English, Dmitri said, his hand still braced against the wall for support. He deserves to know. Alexei's gaze slid to Minsuk with something between assessment and dismissal. Victor's people found the delivery van 2 hours ago. Ran the plates, traced the company, pulled the dispatch records. His accent was thicker than Dmitri's, vowels flattened by Moscow winters. They have your name. Your address. They know your Omega. They're coming. Minsuk's blood turned to ice. How long? They were mobilizing when I left. Could be 20 minutes. Could be here now. Alexei moved to the window, lifted the broken blind a fraction. We need to move. I have cars 3 blocks away, safe house across the city. Wait. Dmitri pushed off the wall, his face gray with pain but his voice commanding. Look. Bottom of the street. Black sedan. Engine running. Minsuk's heart stopped. From his position, he could just see it. A dark shape idling at the corner, exhaust ghosting in the cold morning air. As he watched, a second car pulled up behind it. Then a third. They're doing reconnaissance, Alexei said quietly. Confirming the target before they move. We have maybe 5 minutes. Dmitri was already moving, scooping up Anya with his good arm, his face set in lines of controlled agony. The shoulder wound was bleeding again, a fresh bloom of red soaking through the bandages. Fire escape. Now. Minsuk's apartment building was a relic from the 1970s, all crumbling brick and rusted metal. The fire escape was technically illegal. The landlord had forgotten to maintain it for the last decade. But right now it was the only exit that didn't involve the front door and Victor's men. Minsuk grabbed Alexei, The diaper bag he'd hastily packed with formula and his last clean shirts torn into improvised diapers, and nothing else. The overdue bills stayed on the counter. The life he'd scraped together stayed behind. The window screamed when he forced it open, metal on metal, loud enough to wake the dead. Dmitri was through first despite his injuries, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd escaped worse. Alexei followed, gun drawn, covering their exit. Minsuk climbed through with his son pressed against his chest, the December wind hitting him like a fist. The fire escape groaned under their combined weight. 3 stories down to the alley, the metal lattice swaying with each step. Minsuk's hands shook on the frozen railing as he descended, Alexei's small body warm against him, the baby's face buried in his neck. Above them, Alexei the captain moved like a shadow, his weapon tracking the street below. They were halfway down when the apartment door exploded inward. The sound was unmistakable. Splintering wood shouted Russian, boots on cheap linoleum. Minsuk looked up and saw shapes moving past his window, dark figures flooding his home. Someone shouted. A gunshot cracked the morning air. Move! Dmitri hissed from below, already at ground level. Anya clutched to his chest. His face was bone white, the shoulder wound leaving a trail of blood droplets on the metal stairs. Minsuk's feet hit the alley, just as a figure appeared in the window above, blocky silhouette, raising a weapon. Alexei fired twice, the suppressed shots like coughs in the cold air, and the figure dropped. Go, go, go! The Omega district at 9 a.m. was a maze of narrow alleys and underground passages that serviced the 24-hour businesses. Minsuk knew these streets the way he knew his own hands. 2 years of delivery driving had mapped every shortcut, every blind corner, every place the cameras didn't reach. He grabbed Dmitri's good arm and pulled him left, away from the main street, into the labyrinth. This way. Stay close. They plunged into the morning market, a sprawl of vendor stalls and makeshift shops that catered to the Omega population's night shift workers. The crowd was thin but present, exhausted faces buying breakfast, haggling over produce, pointedly not seeing the blood-stained Alpha and the Omega carrying infants like their lives depended on it. Minsuk navigated on instinct, ducking under a fish vendor's awning, cutting through a restaurant's back entrance where the owner knew him by sight and asked no questions. Behind them, shouts in Russian. Running footsteps. Alexei fired again, covering their retreat, his massive frame blocking a narrow corridor while Dmitri stumbled and Minsuk caught him, taking Anya in his free arm. Both twins now, their combined weight nothing compared to the adrenaline screaming through his system. Left here, Minsuk gasped, pulling them into a maintenance tunnel that connected the old subway station to the district's underground parking. The darkness swallowed them whole, lit only by emergency strips that barely functioned. Dmitri's breathing was ragged, his sense spiking with pain and blood loss, and Minsuk realized with crystal clarity that the Alpha wasn't going to make it much farther. How much longer? Dmitri's voice was threaded with agony he couldn't hide anymore. 2 blocks. There's a parking garage. The north exit comes out near the industrial sector. Your cars won't be there. It was Alexei, breathing hard, his phone screen illuminating his grim expression. Victor hit the safe house. My team is scattered. We're on our own. The tunnel opened into a concrete expanse of parked cars and oil stains. Minsuk's delivery van sat where he'd left it last night, a lifetime ago, still blood-stained and battered but functional. He'd never been more grateful for the company's terrible maintenance schedule that meant no GPS tracking, no digital footprint, just an ancient vehicle that ran on spite and prayer. Get in, he said, making a decision that terrified him. I'm driving. Dmitri looked at him with those cold gray eyes, calculating, assessing. Then he nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, Anya cradled against his chest, his blood seeping onto the upholstery. Alexei took the back with his gun and his grim silence. Minsuk started the engine, hands steady now with purpose, and pulled out of the garage just as Victor's men poured into the tunnel behind them. Bullets sparked off concrete. The van's back window exploded in a shower of safety glass. Alexei returned fire, methodical and precise, buying them seconds. Minsuk floored it, the van lurching into morning traffic, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't following anyone's lead. He was the one who knew these streets, these escape routes, the places where delivery drivers went invisible. Dmitri slumped against the door, his breathing shallow, trusting Minsuk to keep them alive. The power dynamic had shifted. The Omega wasn't helpless prey anymore. And as Minsuk navigated them through the city's veins with Victor's hunters on their trail, he felt something dangerous bloom in his chest. Not just fear, but the savage determination of someone who'd finally found something worth protecting. Where are we going? Alexei asked from the back. Minsuk met Dimitri's eyes in the rearview mirror and saw the Alpha's grim approval. Somewhere they won't look. Somewhere no one looks. He aimed the van toward the city's forgotten edges, toward safety or destruction, and didn't let himself think about the fact that there was no going back now. They were running, and Minsuk was leading, and somehow that felt right. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building that didn't officially exist on any city registry. Minsuk stood in the marble-floored entryway holding both twins, his blood-crusted clothes and trembling hands a stark contrast to the wealth that surrounded him like a physical presence. Crystal chandeliers. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had never looked this small. Furniture that probably cost more than he'd earn in 5 years. He'd driven them through the industrial sectors, the abandoned zones where cameras didn't reach and delivery vans were invisible. Finally arriving at coordinates Alexei had transmitted from a second-burner phone. The building's underground garage had opened like a mouth, swallowing them into fluorescent-lit security and armed men who moved with military precision. Now Dimitri was being half-carried down a hallway by 2 guards, leaving a trail of blood droplets on marble that someone would clean within minutes, erasing all evidence he'd ever been wounded. The Alpha hadn't looked back. Hadn't said anything beyond curt Russian to Alexei about securing perimeters and checking communications. Minsuk had never felt more invisible. This way. A woman appeared. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, her omega scent masked by expensive neutralizers. She gestured down a different corridor with the efficiency of someone used to managing chaos. Mr. Romanov has arranged accommodations. The children need proper care. The nursery was something from a magazine. Twin bassinets with silk bedding, a changing table stocked with actual diapers, formula that didn't come from canned milk and desperation. Minsuk set Alexei and Anya down with hands that shook, watching them settle into comfort they'd never known, and felt something fracture in his chest. 24 hours ago, he'd been wrapping them in kitchen towels. Now they had more than he'd ever had in his entire life. Your room is adjacent, Mr. Volkov insisted. The woman, she hadn't given her name, opened a door that revealed a bedroom suite larger than his entire apartment. King-sized bed with sheets that looked like they cost more than his monthly rent. Ensuite bathroom with marble counters and a shower that could fit 4 people. A walk-in closet already stocked with clothes in his size. I don't. Minsuk's voice came out hoarse. This is too much. This is necessary. Her expression didn't soften. You're under Mr. Volkov's protection now. That comes with certain accommodations. Protection. The word felt like a gilded cage clicking shut. The next hours blurred into surreal domesticity. A Bratva doctor arrived, gray-haired, clinically efficient, the kind of man who'd probably pulled bullets from flesh more times than he'd admit. He disappeared into Dimitri's room with a medical bag and emerged an hour later with blood on his cuffs and a grim nod toward Alexei. He'll live. Stubborn bastard refused sedation until I showed him the security feeds. Said he needed to see something first. Minsuk showered in water hot enough to scald, watching pink-tinged streams circle the drain, and tried not to think about how he'd gone from invisible delivery driver to whatever this was in less than 2 days. The clothes in the closet fit perfectly. Someone had measured him while he wasn't paying attention, cataloged his sizes, decided what he needed. The loss of autonomy should have terrified him. Instead, he just felt numb. He checked on the twins, both sleeping peacefully in their temperature-controlled luxury, and found himself walking toward Dimitri's room without consciously deciding to. The guards at the door assessed him with cold efficiency, but let him pass. Inside, Dimitri sat propped against pillows that probably cost more than Minsuk's education, his torso wrapped in proper bandages, an iPad in his lap, and a phone to his ear. He was conducting business in rapid-fire Russian, his voice cold and commanding, the injured Alpha from this morning replaced by something apex and dangerous. Minsuk stood in the doorway and finally saw him clearly. Not the dying man clutching his children. Not the father gentle with his newborns. This was Dmitri Volkov, head of the Bratva, a man who controlled empires and eliminated threats with the casualness of someone ordering coffee. The gray eyes that found Minsuk across the room were calculating, assessing value and risk in the same glance. Hold, Dmitri said into the phone, then switched to English. Come in. Close the door. Minsuk obeyed, hating how automatic it was. The room was another study in wealth, dark woods, leather furniture, artwork that was probably stolen from museums. Security monitors showed feeds from multiple angles, the building's perimeter, the street below. Dmitri watched him approach with predatory stillness. The twins? Dmitri asked. Sleeping. Federal safe. Minsuk's hands clenched at his sides. This is too much. The room, the clothes, the... It's necessary. Dmitri set the iPad aside with careful movements that betrayed his pain. Victor knows your name, your face, everything about your life. You can't go back to that apartment. Can't go back to delivery driving or whatever existence you had before. His expression was unreadable. You saved my life. That creates obligations. This is how I meet them. I don't want to be an obligation. Then what do you want to be? The question was sharp, cutting through Min-suk's protests. Because right now you're a witness. A loose end. The only reason you're alive is because you're under my protection, and that means you follow my rules. Min-suk's Omega instincts screamed at the alpha dominance radiating from Dmitri, demanding submission, but something stubborn in him pushed back. So I'm a prisoner. You're protected. Dmitri's voice dropped to something dangerous. There's a difference. The guards aren't to keep you in. They're to keep Victor's people out. You want to leave? Leave. But understand that the moment you step outside this building without an escort, you're dead within the hour. The truth of it settled like lead in Min-suk's stomach. He looked at the security feeds, the armed men patrolling. The fortress Dmitri had built from blood and violence. This was his world. Cold. Calculating. Ruthless. And Min-suk had voluntarily walked into it carrying the Alpha's children. I don't belong here, Min-suk said quietly. Something flickered across Dmitri's face. Almost regret, almost understanding. You belonged in an operating room. Instead, you were delivering food in a van that barely ran, living in an apartment that should have been condemned, slowly disappearing into a life that was killing you. He leaned forward despite the obvious pain it caused. You don't belong there either, Malchik. Maybe you belong somewhere you haven't found yet. The words hit harder than they should have. Min-suk looked at this dangerous, wounded alpha who saw too much, and felt the fragile walls he'd built around himself start to crack. What if I don't know how to be here? Then learn. Dmitri picked up his phone again, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. Alexei has assigned you 2 guards. They'll escort you anywhere in the building, and outside only with advance clearance. The twins' care is your responsibility. I trust no one else with them. In return, you have access to everything here. Food, medical supplies, whatever you need. I'm not a kept Omega. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. No. Dmitri's gray eyes met his, and something in them made Min-suk's breath catch. You're the Omega who pulled bullets out of me with a kitchen knife while my children screamed. You're tougher than you think you are. Now prove it. The dismissal was clear. Min-suk turned to leave, his heart hammering against his ribs, but Dmitri's voice stopped him at the door. Min-suk. The Alpha's use of his name felt intimate despite the clinical surroundings. Thank you. For my children. For not running when you should have. A pause. For choosing to save something instead of just surviving. Min-suk didn't trust himself to respond. He stepped into the hallway where 2 guards materialized like shadows, and let them escort him back to his gilded cage of a bedroom where everything was provided except the one thing he wanted. His freedom to choose what came next. The fortress operated on a rhythm Min-suk learned to navigate like a second language. Guards changed shifts at 6-hour intervals. Dmitri's business calls happened in 3-hour blocks, Russian consonants sharp through the walls. The twins woke every 4 hours like clockwork, their hunger an anchor to normalcy in a world that had stopped making sense. Min-suk fell into the routine because the alternative was thinking too hard about how his entire life had been erased in 48 hours. His apartment was a crime scene now. Alexei had shown him the security footage of Victor's men tearing through his belongings, searching for evidence of where they'd gone. They'd found nothing because there was nothing to find. Min-suk had owned so little that his absence left barely a footprint. It was the 3rd night when Dmitri appeared in the nursery doorway at 2 a.m., bare-chested except for bandages, his gray eyes tracking Min-suk rocking Anya against his shoulder. The baby was fussy, uncomfortable in a way that formula and clean diapers couldn't fix. Missing her mother, maybe. Missing the heartbeat she'd known for 9 months. You should be resting, Min-suk said quietly, not turning. Doctor's orders. Doctor's orders don't account for insomnia. Dmitri moved into the room, his scent stronger without the barrier of walls, gunpowder and something darker, richer, that made Min-suk's Omega hindbrain purr with want. Or guilt. Guilt about what? About dragging you into this. Dmitri took Alexei from his bassinet, settling the boy against his chest with practiced ease. You should be somewhere safe. Invisible. Instead, you're in the center of a war because I couldn't die properly. Min-suk finally looked at him, this dangerous alpha holding his son like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to humanity. I made a choice. You don't get to take that from me by feeling guilty about it. Choices made at gunpoint aren't really choices. I had hours to run after you passed out. I stayed. Anya settled against Min-suk's scent, her tiny fist curling in his borrowed shirt. Stop trying to make my decisions for me. I get enough of that from the guards who follow me to the bathroom. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Dimitri's face. They're excessive. I'll talk to Alexei. Don't. Min-suk surprised himself with the vehemence. They're the only reason I can sleep at night knowing Victor's people are looking for me. They fell into silence, rocking their respective infants in the low light of the nursery. Outside, the city glittered like a circuit board, millions of people living lives that didn't involve bullets and betrayal. Min-suk had been one of them a week ago. Now he couldn't remember what that felt like. Tell me about your pack, Dimitri said eventually. The one that disowned you. Min-suk's hands tightened on Anya. Why? Because I want to know who made you think invisibility was survival. The story came out in fragments. His father, a pack enforcer who'd believed male omegas were just late-blooming alphas until Min-suk presented at 19 with a scent like rain and shame. His mother, who'd cried when they'd cast him out but hadn't fought it. The scholarship committee who'd revoked his funding within a week, citing behavioral concerns. That really meant we don't want your kind here. 2 years of delivery driving, ramen for dinner, teaching himself that wanting more was dangerous. They were wrong, Dimitri said when Min-suk finished. His voice carried absolute certainty. About your worth, your capability, everything. They were my family. Family doesn't throw you away for existing. Dimitri's expression went hard, dangerous. When this is over, give me their names. I'll show them what happens to people who hurt what's mine. The possessiveness should have terrified Min-suk. Instead, it lit something warm and dangerous in his chest. I'm not yours. Aren't you? Dimitri's gray eyes found his across the dim nursery. You carry my scent on your skin. My children calm to your heartbeat. You've bled for me, run for me, chosen me over your own safety. Tell me what that is if it's not mine. Min-suk's breath caught. The Omegaverse biology between them had been building for days. Scent compatibility that made his instincts scream mate every time Dimitri was near. The pull of Alpha and Omega that was supposed to be myth but felt visceral as gravity. He'd been ignoring it because acknowledging it meant acknowledging how completely his life had been rewritten. You're still grieving your mate, Min-suk said, deflecting. Irina, you loved her. Dimitri's expression shattered. He looked down at Alexei, his son who had his mother's nose and his father's gray eyes, and something broke behind his carefully maintained control. I failed her. The doctors said complications, but I should have known. Should have protected her better. She gave me everything and his voice cracked. I couldn't even keep her alive long enough to hold them. Min-suk moved without thinking, crossing to Dimitri's side, Anya still in his arms. It wasn't your fault. Childbirth is dangerous. Sometimes bodies fail and medicine can't fix it, and it's not about protection or strength, or anything you could have controlled. I'm supposed to control everything. Dimitri's free hand came up to his face, shaking. That's what being Pakon means. I control the territory, the money, the violence. I couldn't control this. Because she wasn't yours to control. She was a person who loved you and gave you these perfect children and died doing it. And that's tragic and unfair and not your fault. Min-suk's hand found Dimitri's shoulder, the one that wasn't injured, grounding. You want to honor her? Then keep them safe. Keep yourself alive. Stop carrying guilt that belongs to biology and bad luck. Dimitri looked at him then, really looked, and Min-suk saw the man behind the apex predator. Grieving. Terrified. Desperately trying to hold together an empire while his world crumbled. The distance between them dissolved like smoke. The kiss happened in the space between one breath and the next. Dimitri's mouth found his with desperate hunger, grief and want tangled into something that tasted like violence and salvation. Min-suk kissed back because his Omega instincts were screaming yes, and his rational mind had given up arguing days ago. They stood there in the nursery, infants cradled between them, and let the bond that had been building since that first moment in the warehouse finally ignite. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Dimitri's forehead rested against Min-suk's. This is a terrible idea. Probably the worst I've ever had. Min-suk's voice shook. Right after saving you in the first place. Victor sent a message today. Dimitri's hand came up to cup Min-suk's face, thumb tracing his cheekbone with unexpected gentleness. He knows everything about you. Your pack, your address, your work schedule. He's been watching you for months through traffic cameras, building a profile. He knows you saved me. Ice flooded Min-suk's veins. Why? Because he wants me to know that everyone I touch dies. Dimitri's expression went lethal. He thinks making you a target will draw me out. He's right. Then don't. Too late, Malchik. You became mine the moment you chose those children over running. The kiss this time was softer, almost tender, completely at odds with the danger in Dimitri's words. And I protect what's mine. Always. Minsuk stood in the gilded nursery holding Dimitri's daughter while the alpha held his son, their mouths still tasting of each other, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. This was insane. Dangerous. Probably going to get them all killed. But for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt claimed. Wanted. Worth protecting. And when Dimitri kissed him again with the city sprawling below them and danger circling like sharks, Minsuk kissed back and chose the terrible idea over safety one more time. The fracture started with a phone call Minsuk wasn't supposed to hear. He'd been in the penthouse library, a room full of leather-bound books in languages he couldn't read and furniture that cost more than his former life, feeding Anya while Alexei dozed in his carrier. The door to Dimitri's office was slightly ajar, Russian voices filtering through in heated argument. Minsuk had learned to recognize the cadence of Bratva business, the particular edge that meant someone was about to die or be ruined. But this was different. This was fear. He shouldn't have moved closer. Should have stayed in his designated spaces like a good-kept Omega. Instead, he found himself at the door gap, Anya against his shoulder, listening to Dimitri tear someone apart in Russian so vicious it needed no translation. Then the language switched. Not possible. I vetted everyone personally after the coup. There is no mole. That was Alexei, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Then explain how Victor knew about the shipment before my own people did. Dimitri's voice was ice. Explain how he's 3 steps ahead on every move we make. Someone is feeding him information, and if it's not you, then it's someone close enough to you that the distinction doesn't matter. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. We need to shut down operations. Go dark until. Until what? Until Victor consolidates power, and we have nothing left to reclaim. Dimitri's footsteps pacing. He's planning something. Targeting the legitimate businesses. The ones that keep us liquid, keep us legal enough that the feds stay away. He burns those. We're just another gang fighting over scraps. Minsuk's blood went cold. He'd heard this before. Not in this office, but in another phone conversation 2 days ago when he'd taken the twins to the rooftop garden for air. A voice he hadn't recognized, speaking in careful English to someone on the other end. The clubs first, then the real estate holdings. Draw the wolf out by burning his den. At the time, he'd thought it was about some other conflict. The Bratva had enemies beyond Victor. But now, the office door opened fully and Dimitri stood there, gray eyes locking onto Minsuk with predatory precision. How long have you been listening? Long enough. Minsuk shifted Anya to his other shoulder, refusing to flinch. There's something you need to know. The conversation he'd overheard spilled out in the office with Alexei listening, his expression growing darker with each detail. Minsuk described the voice, educated accent, younger than Dimitri, American but with something Eastern European underneath. The exact phrasing about the clubs and real estate. The timeline, 3 days from now. Pyotr. Alexei said the name like a curse. Victor's nephew. He's been in New York for 2 months, supposedly setting up new distribution. But if he's here, then Victor's moving faster than we thought. Dimitri's hand slammed down on the desk hard enough to make Minsuk jump. And we have a leak that goes high enough to know our defensive positions. His gaze swung to Minsuk, something unreadable flickering across his face. You should have told me immediately. I didn't know it mattered until now. Minsuk's voice came out sharper than he intended. I'm not exactly included in your operational briefings. Because you're not supposed to be operational. Dimitri moved around the desk, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. You're supposed to be safe. Protected. Not gathering intelligence in hallways. I was feeding your daughter, not conducting espionage. The distinction is irrelevant if Victor's people identify you as an asset. Dimitri's jaw tightened and Minsuk recognized the look. The same calculation he'd seen in the warehouse, weighing risks and costs. Alexei arranged transport. Secure cabin upstate, the one we used after the Kozlov situation. Full security detail, rotation every 6 hours. Minsuk's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? You're leaving. Tonight. You and the twins. Dimitri wouldn't meet his eyes. Victor knows about you. He's building a file, and the moment he decides your leverage, you become a target I can't adequately protect here. So you're sending me away. The words tasted like ash. Minsuk had heard this song before. Different words, same meaning. You're a liability. You're not worth the risk. You're disposable. I'm keeping you alive. Dimitri's voice rose, control slipping. Do you understand what Victor will do if he gets his hands on you? What he'll do to my children. I lost Irina. I'm not. He stopped, breathing hard. I'm not losing anyone else. So you're making my decisions for me again. Minsuk set Anya in her carrier with shaking hands. Just like the guards. The clothes. The gilded cage you've built around me. I'm not a person to you. I'm a responsibility you're trying to manage. Dmitri caught himself, jaw working. You're someone I can't afford to lose. Because I'm useful with the twins? Because I saved your life and now you owe me. Minsuk's voice cracked. Or because you kissed me 3 nights ago and now you feel obligated to keep the Omega you've claimed? The silence was deafening. Alexei cleared his throat uncomfortably and made for the door, but Dmitri's hand shot out. Stay. This concerns security. This concerns me being discarded the moment I become inconvenient. Minsuk grabbed the diaper bag he'd learned to keep packed, formula, diapers, the few possessions he'd been allowed. My pack did this. Decided I was a problem they couldn't solve and removed me from the equation. I thought you were different. I'm trying to keep you alive by sending me away where you don't have to see me, where I can't complicate your war or remind you that you're grieving. Minsuk moved toward the door, past Alexei's uncomfortable presence, and Dmitri didn't stop him. Don't worry, Dmitri. I know how this works. I'll take care of your children. I'll stay in whatever remote location you've decided is far enough away. And when this is over and Victor is dead, you can collect us like luggage you left at a train station. Minsuk. No. He turned at the doorway, Anya and Alexei in their carriers, his entire world reduced to what he could carry. You want to protect me? Then treat me like an equal instead of a thing you own. But you can't do that, can you? Because I'm just an Omega you pulled from poverty, and this, he gestured at the opulent office, the fortress, the life he'd been dropped into. This was never about me. It was about your guilt and your grief and your need to control something after your mate died. Dmitri's face went white. That's not. It is. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Minsuk's hands tightened on the carrier handles. I'll go to your cabin. I'll keep them safe. But don't confuse obedience with acceptance. I'm leaving because they need me, not because you've convinced me I matter to you as anything other than a convenient caretaker. He walked out before Dmitri could respond, Alexei's guards materializing like shadows to escort him, and didn't let himself look back. Behind him, he heard something crash, Dmitri's rage finally breaking through his control, but Minsuk kept walking. The SUV was waiting in the underground garage, black and anonymous. Minsuk secured the twins in professional car seats someone had installed, accepted the go bag full of supplies without comment, and climbed into the back seat. 2 guards in front, one following in a second vehicle. Enough security to make him feel like precious cargo or a prisoner. Maybe both. As they pulled out into the city night, Minsuk looked up at the penthouse 3 floors from heaven and saw Dmitri's silhouette in the window. Watching. Still trying to control outcomes, even as Minsuk disappeared into the darkness. He closed his eyes and let the city lights blur past. Anya's small hand wrapped around his finger, and told himself this was just another abandonment. Another powerful alpha deciding he wasn't worth the complication. Told himself the ache in his chest was just survival instinct, not heartbreak. Told himself he'd be fine alone again, the way he always had been. And almost believed it. The cabin sat 3 hours north of the city, buried in woods so deep that cell service was a prayer and hope. Minsuk spent the first 2 days learning its rhythms. The way the floorboards creaked, the blind spots in the security cameras, the rotation schedule of the guards Dmitri had assigned. Pavel and Mikhail, both ex-military, both carrying enough firepower to level a small building. They were professional, polite, and completely uninterested in Minsuk beyond keeping him breathing. He told himself it was fine. He had the twins, enough formula to last a week, and books he couldn't focus on because his mind kept circling back to Dmitri's expression when he'd walked out. The white-faced shock, the control fracturing, the silence that had said more than any argument could. On the 3rd night, Minsuk woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that came before violence. The same predatory quiet he'd felt in that warehouse a lifetime ago. Anya was fussing in her bassinet, a soft mewling that hadn't yet escalated to crying. Alexei slept on, oblivious. Minsuk's Omega instincts screamed danger before his conscious mind caught up. The guards' voices were missing. Pavel always hummed while doing perimeter checks, off-key Russian folk songs that drifted through the cabin walls. Mikhail's footsteps on the porch were clockwork every 45 minutes. Silence. Minsuk moved to the window, careful not to silhouette himself against the lamplight. The woods were dark, moonless, but he caught movement. 3 figures. No, 4. Approaching with tactical precision. fanning out to cover exits. Professional. Military trained. Not Dimitri's people. His hands shook as he scooped up both twins, Anya's fussing turning to full cries now as if she sensed his terror. The cabin had a panic room. Dimitri had shown him on the security feed before he'd left, voice clinical and distant. Reinforced door, separate communication line. Enough supplies to last 3 days. Min-suk made it halfway across the living room before the front door exploded inward. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The flashbang turned the world white and silent. Min-suk's ears rang as he stumbled, clutching the twins, his body curling around them on instinct. When his vision cleared, 3 men in tactical gear surrounded him, rifles trained center mass. A fourth entered through the door, and Min-suk's stomach turned to ice. Alexei Romanov walked in like he owned the place. Because he did. Had always owned it. The loyal captain, Dimitri's right hand, the man who'd arranged this cabin, these guards, this perfect trap. "Don't scream," Alexei said in English, his accent suddenly less pronounced, more calculated. "The twins are already crying loud enough." "You," Min-suk's voice came out strangled. "Dimitri trusted you. Dimitri is a sentimental fool who let his mate's death make him weak." Alexei crouched down to Min-suk's level, his ice-blue eyes cold as a winter grave. "Victor offered me what I should have had from the beginning. Leadership. The Volkov Empire doesn't need a grieving widower at its head. It needs someone willing to make hard choices. Murdering children is a hard choice?" Min-suk held the twins tighter, their cries reaching a fever pitch. "Leverage is leverage." Alexei stood, gestured to his men. "Get them in the vehicle. Carefully. Victor wants them alive." "What about the guards? Pavel and Mikhail?" Alexei's expression didn't change. "They did their duty. Unfortunately, their duty ended when I decided it should." The implications settled like lead. Min-suk's mind raced as the tactical team hauled him to his feet, professional hands securing his arms while leaving the twins in his grip. Pavel and Mikhail were dead. The communication line was cut. Alexei would have ensured that first. No one was coming. Dimitri didn't even know this was happening. They loaded him into a black SUV that smelled like gun oil and leather. Alexei sat beside him, phone out, typing with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Victor will be pleased. The Omega and both heirs. Dimitri will come running. He'll kill you." Min-suk's voice shook, but he forced the words out. "You betrayed him. When he finds out, it will be too late." Alexei's phone chimed. He smiled, cold and satisfied. "Victor sends his regards. He's rather excited to meet the Omega who saved Dimitri's life. He has questions about your medical knowledge. Apparently, people who can remove bullets are useful in our line of work." Terror spiked through Min-suk's chest, but beneath it, something else sparked. Rage. He'd been discarded by his pack, expelled from his calling, reduced to invisible poverty, and just when he'd started to matter, to Dimitri, to these children, to himself, he was being reduced to leverage again. No. He looked at Alexei's phone, at the tactical team focused on driving, at the way they'd dismissed him as harmless. Just an Omega. Just a caretaker. No threat at all. His father's voice echoed from a decade ago. "Healers know how to kill, Min-suka. We just choose not to. But never forget, the knowledge is power." Min-suk settled Anya and Alexei Jr. against his chest, their cries subsiding as his scent wrapped around them, and began to observe. The driver had a sidearm on his right hip. The passenger kept his rifle between his knees. Alexei's phone was biometric locked, but he'd seen the pattern when the traitor had unlocked it. 3 swipes, bottom left to top right. The SUV's child locks were engaged, but the manual release was under the seat trim. The cabin's medical kit had been in his diaper bag. They'd confiscated the bag, but hadn't searched it beyond a cursory check for weapons. Inside, infant pain reliever, antiseptic wipes, a thermometer, and a small bottle of morphine sulfate he'd taken from the penthouse medical supply. Just in case. For emergencies. This qualified. "Where are we going?" Min-suk asked, injecting his voice with the trembling fear they expected. "The Volkov estate. Dimitri's family home." Alexei didn't look up from his phone. "Poetic, don't you think? Victor takes everything from him in the place where it all began. Will you kill him? That depends on how cooperative he is." Alexei finally looked at him, assessing. "You care about him. I can smell it on you, the bond forming. Pathetic, really. He was never going to keep you. You were a convenience. A temporary solution to childcare." The words hit exactly where Alexei intended, confirming every fear Min-suk had carried since leaving the penthouse. But now, with his children, because they were his now, had been since that first night in his apartment, in danger, he couldn't afford the luxury of heartbreak. I know, Min-suk said quietly, channeling every ounce of his pack's rejection, his university's dismissal, his own internalized worthlessness. I always knew. Alexei smiled, satisfied that he'd broken something. He went back to his phone. Min-suk went back to planning. The estate was 2 hours away. 2 hours to figure out how to turn a bottle of morphine, a thermometer, and an Omega's harmless appearance into survival. 2 hours before Dmitri walked into an ambush for children and an Omega he'd sent away to protect. The SUV's heater hummed. The twins dozed fitfully against Min-suk's chest. Alexei coordinated with Victor in Russian, his betrayal complete and thorough. And Min-suk, the invisible Omega who'd spent 2 years learning to disappear, began calculating exactly how visible he could be when it mattered. His father had been right. Healers knew anatomy, knew pressure points and vulnerabilities, knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum damage. He'd saved Dmitri with that knowledge. Now he'd use it to save them all. Or die trying. But he was done being helpless. Done being leverage. Done being dismissed. When the SUV pulled through the estate gates 2 hours later and Viktor Kozlov stood waiting with an army at his back and victory in his eyes, Min-suk met his gaze and smiled. The wolf had sent away his Omega to keep him safe. The Omega was about to show him exactly how dangerous safety had made him. The Volkov estate was a monument to old money and older violence. Stone walls, iron gates, the kind of architecture that had witnessed generations of bloodshed and would witness more before the night ended. Victor stood in the grand foyer like a king in borrowed robes, 20 armed men at his back, and Min-suk bound to a chair with the twins in a playpen beside him. Alexei had delivered them 3 hours ago. 3 hours Min-suk had spent playing the terrified Omega while his mind calculated angles and odds, and the precise dosage of morphine sulfate needed to incapacitate without killing. The twins need formula, Min-suk had whispered to his guard. Young, nervous, the kind who'd joined the Bratva for money rather than conviction. They haven't eaten since the cabin. They'll dehydrate. The guard had hesitated, then retrieved the diaper bag. Min-suk had prepared bottles with shaking hands, making a show of his fear while palming the morphine vial. The guards had taken shifts watching him, drinking from the same water bottles he'd carefully, invisibly contaminated while asking for towels to clean spit up. Now 2 guards slumped against the walls, pupils pinpoint, breathing shallow. 3 more had left their posts to vomit in the bathroom. The young nervous one was unconscious in the corner. Victor hadn't noticed yet. His attention was fixed on the gates where headlights cut through the darkness. Dmitri had come. The Alpha emerged from the SUV alone as instructed, hands visible, unarmed in a way that was somehow more threatening than if he'd arrived with an army. He walked through the estate doors with the contained violence of a storm about to break, gray eyes finding Min-suk across the foyer before locking onto Victor with murderous focus. "You have something of mine," Dmitri said, his voice arctic. "I have everything of yours." Victor gestured expansively at the estate, at the men, at Min-suk and the twins. "Your home. Your power. Your pathetic little family. Did you really think you could keep any of it? You, who cried over a dead Omega like a lovesick boy. Who let grief make you soft. Irina's death didn't make me soft." Dmitri took a step forward and 3 rifles trained on him. He didn't flinch. "It made me understand exactly how much I'm willing to lose. Then you'll understand this." Victor pulled a handgun, aimed it casually at the playpen where Anya and Alexei slept in drugged exhaustion. "You have 10 seconds to kneel. To acknowledge my leadership. Or I demonstrate exactly how easily replaceable children are." Min-suk moved before thinking, his bound hands grabbing the chair and hurling himself between Victor and the twins. The gunshot was deafening in the marble foyer, and the bullet meant for Anya punched into Min-suk's shoulder instead, spinning him sideways, pain white-hot and clarifying. Time fractured. Dmitri's roar was inhuman, alpha rage given voice. He moved like violence incarnate, covering the distance to Victor in 3 strides. The first guard who tried to stop him took a knife. Where had Dmitri gotten a knife? To the throat. The second got his windpipe crushed with a backhand strike. The third discovered that unarmed didn't mean helpless when Dmitri used his own rifle to beat him unconscious. Victor fired twice more, but Dmitri was already moving, flowing between bullets with the muscle memory of someone who'd learned violence before language. His hand closed around Victor's gun wrist and twisted with surgical precision. Bone snapped. Victor screamed. "You wanted to know if grief made me weak?" Dmitri's voice was conversational despite the carnage. He drove his knee into Victor's ribs with enough force to crack bone. "Let me clarify. Grief gave me nothing left to lose. and a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in this world. The remaining conscious guards, the ones Minsuk's morphine hadn't reached, tried to intervene. Alexei among them, the traitor's face twisted with rage at seeing his coup unravel. But they were fighting an alpha who'd stopped caring about survival the moment Minsuk had taken that bullet. The fight was brutal. Knives and fists and the wet sound of violence meeting flesh. Dmitri took hits that should have dropped him and kept moving, kept killing, a machine built from vengeance and wrath. When Alexei raised his weapon, Dmitri caught his wrist and broke it with the same casual efficiency he'd used to open a letter. 20 years, Dmitri said to his former captain. 20 years of loyalty, and you sold it for what? Victor's promises? A title he'd never give you. He drove the knife, definitely a knife now, pulled from Alexei's own belt, between the traitor's ribs with precision. You were always too ambitious. I just hoped you were smart enough to hide it. Alexei dropped, blood pooling, and Dmitri turned back to Victor. What followed wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Dmitri took Victor apart piece by piece, methodical and vicious, while Minsuk held pressure on his shoulder wound with bound hands and watched the man he'd tried not to love become something terrifying and magnificent. When Victor finally stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped being anything but a corpse in an expensive suit, Dmitri turned to Minsuk. His hands were covered in blood. His shirt was shredded. His gray eyes were wild with alpha instinct and barely contained panic. You threw yourself in front of a bullet. Dmitri's voice cracked. You idiotic, brave, stupid. The twins are fine, Minsuk said through gritted teeth. Blood loss was making him dizzy. I poisoned half the guards. The others, you handled them. His laugh came out wet. We make a good team. You're bleeding out. Dmitri dropped to his knees, hands hovering over the wound like he was afraid to touch. I sent you away to keep you safe and you. I kept myself safe. Kept them safe. Minsuk's vision was graying at the edges, but he forced the words out. I'm not helpless. Never was. You just needed to see it. I see it. Dmitri's hands finally found the wound, applying pressure with a gentleness that belied the violence still dripping from his fingers. I see you. God help me, I've seen you since that warehouse. Since you pulled bullets out with a kitchen knife and looked at me like I was worth saving. You are. Minsuk's head lolled against Dmitri's chest. Even when you're being an overprotective asshole who makes decisions for me. I was terrified. The confession tore out of Dmitri like broken glass. Of losing you. Of caring about you. Of letting you become something I couldn't survive losing. His voice dropped to something raw and desperate. You were never a responsibility. Never temporary. You're mine. My mate. My equal. And I'm an idiot who almost lost you by trying to keep you safe. The words settled into Minsuk's chest, warm despite the blood loss. Then stop protecting me from your world, he whispered. I'm already in it. Been in it since I chose them. Chose you. Dmitri's hand came up to cup his face, thumb tracing his cheekbone with devastating tenderness. I'm going to fix this. The wound. The bleeding. I'm going to. Bite me. Minsuk's eyes met his, clear despite the pain. The mating bite. Alpha pheromones can stabilize shock. Speed healing. I remember from school. It's our only chance before I bleed out. That's a myth. So is us. So is any of this. Do it. Dmitri's hesitation lasted a heartbeat. Then his hand slid into Minsuk's hair, tilting his head to expose the scent gland at his throat, and his teeth found the vulnerable skin with claiming possession. The pain was sharp and sweet and perfect, alpha pheromones flooding Minsuk's system like liquid fire. The bond snapped into place, not gentle, not soft, but inevitable as gravity. Minsuk gasped as his body responded. Omega biology recognizing its mate, cells accelerating healing in ways science couldn't explain and didn't need to. The bleeding slowed. The dizziness receded. And beneath it all, he felt Dmitri in his mind, his heart, his soul, permanent and claiming and absolutely right. When Dmitri pulled back, his mouth was bloody and his eyes were molten. Mine, he growled. Yours, Minsuk confirmed, then smiled with blood on his teeth. But I'm keeping my autonomy. And my opinions. And my right to throw myself in front of bullets if I decide it's necessary. We're going to have a very long discussion about your definition of necessary. Looking forward to it. Minsuk's hand found the twins, both stirring now, crying for formula and familiar comfort. But first, your children need their father. And I need medical attention. Actual medical attention. From a real doctor. Dmitri laughed, the sound broken and relieved and utterly human. He gathered Minsuk and the twins into his arms like they were the only things tethering him to sanity. And maybe they were. I love you, he said into Minsuk's hair. In case the mating bite didn't make that clear. I love you. I know. Minsuk's eyes closed, exhaustion and blood loss finally catching up. I love you too. Now get us out of this nightmare mansion, and somewhere with actual medical supplies before I pass out. Dmitri stood, cradling his entire world, and carried them through the carnage he'd created. Behind them, Victor's body cooled beside Alexei's. The coup ended in blood and vengeance. Ahead, sirens wailed. Someone had finally called it in. But Minsuk wasn't afraid anymore. He was claimed. He was mated. He was exactly where he belonged. In the arms of an alpha who'd learned that love wasn't weakness, and beside children who'd never doubt they were wanted. The Omega who'd been invisible had finally been seen. And he was never disappearing again.